Thank you, Rocco, and thank you all for being here. I'm honored to be here today to talk with you about this very critical subject. Clearly, with our newspaper this morning and what we've heard from everyone, that the GMO issue is on the top of the agenda at this point in Serbia. How to reconcile your own self-sufficiency as a nation, we'll talk more about this later on, how to reconcile that with the demand of the European Union to accept certain requirements for GMOs. But before we get to that, I'd like to go back and really talk in a broader way about our agricultural system and where GMOs fit into that. Very fundamental to our world is that a healthy, sustainable food system is the basis for health for the individual, for the nation, and for our dear planet as well. Without a healthy system, without a healthy food system, the world cannot be healthy on any level. It's just the way it is. And another very critical point to recognize is that the way we produce food is a big contributor to all of the major problems facing humanity today. Whether it's climate change, there's a list of them here, I won't go through them, but each one of them intersects in a very fundamental way with the food system. This is both a concern, but it also offers hope, because if the food system as it operates now is a big part of the problem, then fixing the food system, making it more sustainable, is capable of basically solving a big piece of the problem. And so this is what we're putting our energy into, is creating that better food system for a more sustainable world. And we have to address every level, from the seed producer and the farmer all the way to the citizen at the other end who eats the food. Every level needs to be dealt with. And today I'm going to be talking mostly at the agricultural level, though we'll come back to the broader picture as well. And we'll look at the whole range of agriculture. And just as a quick summary of, we'll come back to agriculture, ecological agriculture later, but just a quick summary of the differences between agriculture as it's now practiced commonly, chemical agriculture, and ecological approaches. Typically, the difference is that one of these systems works with nature and the other says, well, nature's not good enough, we have to fix it, we have to add chemicals to the soil and pesticides and all of these sorts of things. One really recognizes the intelligence of nature that's embodied in the farmer and in the seed and the land. The other relies primarily on human intelligence in the form of technology. One cycles resources and integrates all of the products back into the system. The other resource is resource depleting. And in this respect, ecological agriculture really creates nourishment based on the sun's energy, whereas with chemical agriculture, you're actually using 10 calories of petroleum or other fossil inputs in order to produce a single calorie of food. 10 calories of non-renewable energy for 1 calorie of food. So in essence, when you eat this food, you're eating petroleum. It's not a very sustainable system. The principle of ecological agriculture is that if you create a balanced soil, the crop will be nourished properly, and that the healthy crop will resist pests of all sorts. Whereas with chemical agriculture, you use imbalanced chemical nitrogen fertilizer. The plants are imbalanced in many ways, and as a result, they're not able to resist the pests. And so you have to wage chemical war on the bugs. So all of these things are part of the problem. A farm should generate nourishment, but the way it's seen today is that it generates product. It's a factory for product that can be sold in the marketplace. The production aspect overrides the nourishment aspect of the whole thing. One focuses on the farmer and the community. The other is the chemical agricultural system mainly extracts value from the agricultural community into the pockets of faraway investors. All of these are problems. Is the farmer a leader or is the farmer a laborer? That's the difference between these two systems. And for all of us as eaters, as consumers of food, one offers food that's more nutritious, better tasting, healthier, as opposed to food that, you wonder what it is you're eating. It's so bland, so boring. So we'll come back to this broader picture, but now I'd like to focus on the other end of the spectrum and on the biotech agriculture, on GMOs, and really go deeply into to the whole issue. And I think it's key for us to really begin by understanding, reviewing what genetic engineering really is. Because when you look at it, when you actually understand and see clearly what it is, it becomes obvious why it's a problem. So it's really, on the surface level, it's been developed and designed as sort of a new module to add to chemical agriculture, something that integrates into it and sort of props the whole system up, and in fact is the most extreme aspect of chemical agriculture as it's practiced today. But what is genetic engineering? And this slide just illustrates the point that DNA, or genes, are the blueprints for proteins. If you look inside any living organism, here a soybean, I know Serbia is one of the most abundant producers of soybeans in Europe, actually. And within any living thing, you find cells. And within the cells, you find each cell is the nucleus. And within that, chromosomes. And within the core of each chromosome is a strand of DNA that carries information, the blueprint for the physiology of that organism. Whether it's a soybean or a human being, they're both really guided by this blueprint, this genetic blueprint. The principle of genetic engineering is that because genes are the blueprints for every aspect of our physiology, whether it's proteins or carbohydrates or the nucleic acids or the fats, ultimately each of those components is either the proteins directly programmed by genes, or they're synthesized by enzymes that are in fact proteins that have their own genetic blueprints in terms of genes. And the rationale of genetic engineering, it's very, very powerful rationale. It's a very seductive rationale. It's one that drew me in 40 years ago into taking on genetic engineering as a career. As a molecular biologist, I used this technology for years in research, in understanding how cells work, in particular understanding how the process of cancer occurs, and how all sorts of chemical pollutants in the environment trigger cancer. So anyway, the rationale is that if you can modify the genes, you can modify any part of the organism. It's a powerful concept. It's going from pre-programmed biology to being able to reprogram the biological system to do whatever you want. And it's a license for megalomania among scientists, I would say. It puts us in a position of power with respect to biology that humanity has never had before. And the key thing is that tools, genetic engineering at one end of the spectrum, a hammer at the other end, can be used for good or bad. You can build something very beautiful using a hammer and other tools. You can also destroy things with that tool. It's how the tool is used that is most fundamentally of concern. So how is genetic engineering done? You start out with any organism, bacteria, viruses, plants, animals, and you isolate genes from them. And then you cut out pieces of those genes, like this. And you cut them out and you put them together. And you create a recombinant gene. Now this process is very precise. You can cut and splice the DNA in a test tube, in culture, in these sorts of things that are used for this process. You can cut and splice the DNA with base by base precision. The same precision with which you can cut and splice sentences and words and paragraphs using your word processor. Very precise. And the proponents of genetic engineering say, oh, look how precise this technology is. It's so safe because we have complete control. But although it's true for this one step, this is only the first step in creating a GMO crop. And the next step is shown here. You have to take the transgene and insert it into a cell. And once it's in the cell, you have to induce the cell to integrate that into their own DNA. And then once this happens in a petri dish, you have to, then you add some hormones to the petri dish, and it induces that single cell to sprout, to grow some roots, to grow some sprouts. And then finally you end up with a transgenic plant. Now if it were all as simple as shown in this slide, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be here today expressing concern about GMOs. I'd be out there developing GMOs. But in fact, that's not the case. There are big problems with this technology. This process that we've described in this last slide is not precise. It's not controlled. In fact, we do not even know how it is. All we know is that if you do this first step, if you get the DNA into the cell, that somehow, by some unknown and uncharacterized process, it once in a while will get integrated into the DNA of the plant. But this is a hit or miss process. It's random, it's uncontrolled, and within that unpredictability come the big problems with GMOs. This process causes mutations in the DNA, and because living things are so complex, you can't predict the outcome. So let's look at that in more detail. Here you see this process of insertion again. When you insert that transgene into a normal cell, it requires a lot of, and once it's in there, it could insert in between these two genes. The green and the blue are natural genes. And so it could be inserted in between them, as is shown here, where you end up with all of the genes functioning. Or the transgene could be inserted into the middle of the gene, and then you have big problems, because you've destroyed one of the natural genes of the cell. There's another problem as well, and that is that the model that's used by genetic engineers just doesn't work. It doesn't connect with reality. The model is on this side, and the model is that you change one gene, you insert one gene, and it has a single effect within the cell. It changes one enzyme within the metabolic network. This gives rise to one change at the cellular level, one at the tissue and organ level, one at the crop plant level. So this is the model they use. They say we have complete control over what's going on. But this isn't the reality of the situation. When you insert one gene, this influences other genes as well. So, and each of those then affects something, at least one thing, probably many things, at the level of the intracellular milieu, the metabolic functioning of the cell. This gives rise not to one change, but multiple changes at the level of the cell, the tissue, the organism as a whole. And the problem is that the system, even a single living organism, whether it's a human being or a plant, it's very complex. And so when you change one thing, it affects all of these others. There's one of the founders of the environmental movement in the U.S., his name was John Muir. And he said something very beautiful about this. He said, if you reach out and you grab a hold of anything in nature and give it a tug, you pull on it, you discover that it's not isolated, but it's connected to everything else in the universe. And this is true with genetic engineering as it is with everything else in life. And so somebody with a PhD or even a Nobel laureate in genetics could not predict the effects of changing a single gene in a single plant. It's just not possible to predict it. And as a result, there will be unexpected, unintended side effects. In terms of health, these hazards are in the form of allergens, toxins, and reduced nutritional value of these crops. In fact, there are examples already identified, characterized in the scientific literature of these things. There are genetically engineered crops that are allergenic. There are ones that are toxic to human beings, to livestock. And there are ones that are reduced in nutritional value. There's a whole literature on this. Hundreds of studies have been done showing that GMOs have these problems. It's not hypothetical, it's real. We published a book online about this. It's called GMO Myths and Truths. It has over 600 citations in it, most of them peer-reviewed from the scientific literature. So it's not, it's real on that level. And I won't go into detail, but I will talk about one of these studies. This is a study done by Gilles-Éric Seralini, a French scientist, and he looked at one GMO. It's called NK603 maize, and it is used in conjunction with an herbicide called Roundup. And what he showed is that these two components, together and independently, cause increased mortality to the, he did this with laboratory animals, caused increased mortality, in fact, meaning the animals died earlier at a younger age. It caused liver and kidney toxicity. It increased the incidence of tumors and caused these tumors to appear more earlier in the lifetime of these rats. And he used very low levels of the GM maize in the diet. He used very, very low levels of the Roundup herbicide, and still these very striking changes occurred. Here are some of the mammary tumors that he saw in this study. And this was commonly seen in the rats that were fed these two with the NK603 corn. These are scary, these are very concerning pictures, but this is real, these are real results from a serious study. And you say, well, how is it then that the European Commission approved this GMO? How is it that they could have done it? And the reason behind that is that instead of doing a 2-year study, they did only a 90-day study. They required Monsanto to do a 90-day study. So instead of really looking carefully, is that they just sort of looked inside and said, no, it's okay, and approved it, basically. So they didn't really look deeply. So when you extend that study to 4 months, you begin to see the tumors and the liver toxicity and the kidney toxicity. And as you go forward further, you see these problems coming up more and more and more. So unless you do really rigorous science, you do not really test the safety of these things sufficiently. And so, and in fact, what has happened around the world, and this is documented in detail in our study, GMO Myths and Truths, it's shown very clearly there. Also, we did another one called Roundup and Birth Effects. Has the public been kept in the dark? And both of these studies have shown that, in fact, there is sort of a collusion between the regulators and the industry. And the industry influences the regulators to accept these GMOs even though they're not safe. Even though they're not safe. So there's a good reason why, even though this new, the EU is saying you must accept GMOs, it's very critical that you also set up a ban, a moratorium on GMOs so that you can really control this technology before it comes in. There are 5 or 6 countries in the European Union that already have moratoria on GMOs. So even though you're entering Europe, the European Union, you as a country, Serbia as a country, can take a stand and ban GMOs as well. So I really encourage you to do that because this is an untested technology. It's a technology that's still highly controversial and one that you simply, from my perspective, if I were you, I would say no to this technology. In addition to health hazards, there are environmental hazards. They're summarized quickly here. The use of these toxic chemicals as part of agriculture increases pollution of the environment and also incidence of cancer, birth defects, and other diseases. There's reduction of soil fertility, creation of super weeds and super pests of other sorts. Destruction of biodiversity, loss of species that are important both environmentally and agriculturally. Destruction of centers of biodiversity for important crops. They've been trying to get genetically modified maize introduced into Mexico. And just last week, the courts in Mexico again upheld the ban on GM maize in Mexico because Mexico is the center of origin of maize, and so by bringing it in there would disrupt that whole situation. So it's very critical that you recognize these environmental hazards as well. Just looking at these in a little bit more detail, there are GM crops that they say that GM crops reduce the use of pesticides, but the reality is that wherever they've been introduced around the world, they actually increase the use of pesticides as a whole. And these are just some of the statistics on this. They say that, and another problem is the creation of these super weeds when you use the GM crops. Here's an example from Brazil. The green in here is soybeans, but the big crop, the big plants in there are called buva. And in fact, this field has been sprayed with another herbicide, so the buva has been killed, but you can see that the soy crop is quite stunted. It's quite stunted. In the US, GMOs are grown commonly, and interestingly, the GM crops themselves become weeds. This is a soybean field, but you see growing up in it GM maize. And so both of them were herbicide resistant, resistant to the herbicide Roundup, and the year before, this field had maize in it, Roundup-resistant maize. This year they planted soy, and the maize comes up as a weed. Now it's all brown, the maize is brown because they sprayed it, the farmer has had to spend the money to spray with another herbicide to kill the maize, which is a weed. So this technology gets in its own way. It creates problems for the farmers as an ongoing problem around the world. And so now there are over 24 weeds that are now resistant to Roundup. And literally millions of acres that are infested with herbicide-resistant weeds. There are places in the U.S. where the cotton farmers have essentially walked away from a crop because there were more weeds in the field than there was cotton. It's very, very problematic. The industry's solution to this is to create GMOs that are resistant to other herbicides, many that are even more toxic than Roundup. Things like 2,4-D and dicamba. 2,4-D is one of the components of Agent Orange, which was used in Vietnam to defoliate the forests during that war. And you know, it caused a huge problem of birth defects in Vietnam. So this is not a real solution. This is called replacing one lie with another. So we see that there are big problems with GMOs, both environmentally and in terms of health. And you might say, well, perhaps those risks would be worth it if GMO crops brought massive economic benefits, or if they help to feed the world. But do GMOs accomplish this? Do they contribute in this way? Do they contribute economic benefits? Well, here are some examples of where, in fact, GMOs have done just the opposite. In 2000, there was a GMO that accidentally contaminated crops in the U.S. called Starling. And it contaminated the U.S. maize supply in a massive way. And it resulted in massive recalls of consumer products and huge problems in the supply chain for maize. And literally, this problem caused the company that made this particular GMO was called Aventis. And the problems were so large that it caused Aventis to go bankrupt. They spent well over the publicly acknowledged number is over $1 billion of lawsuits that they had to pay. But in fact, it was over $2 billion in reality, the costs connected with this particular contamination event. In 2006, a similar thing happened with GM rice. And this was a GM rice owned by Bayer, the German company. And it was grown, interesting, only for 1 year as part of field trials in Mississippi and Louisiana in the U.S. And out of that came contamination of the whole U.S. rice industry. And as a result, there were huge loss of markets around the world. The U.S. used to export rice a lot to the EU and to Japan, and as a result of this contamination, they lost those markets completely. At the time I made this slide, there hadn't been, it hadn't developed yet, but at this point, there have been literally hundreds of lawsuits that have been brought in the U.S. on this topic. And again, Bayer is spending more than $1 billion to pay off these lawsuits. It's been massive. There are, you know, I could take another 15 minutes to go through all of the problems that have come up with the impacts, the damaging impacts of GMOs on farmers. These are just a few examples. Another one here from Europe. Spain used to produce a great deal of organic maize. Today it's much less because Spain is the one European country, a little bit in Portugal as well, but mostly Spain, where GM maize is being produced. And it cross-pollinates with the organic maize, and they lose their ability to sell it as organic. So the organic farmers have been greatly harmed by this. And it just shows that you cannot, GM agriculture and natural agriculture cannot coexist. The one pushes the other out. And this is happening in many places around the world. Here are some other economic and social impacts. In Argentina, back in early 2000s, they introduced GM soy. And this resulted in, as this Roundup-ready soy expanded in Argentina, it had a huge, huge impact on the society. It pushed rural populations. It pushed the small farmers out of the countryside and forced them into the slums of the cities, of the large cities. It concentrated agricultural production in the hands of a few wealthy producers. It reduced the biodiversity of the food production system. There was literally loss of access to a good diet among many of the poorer people in Argentina. And there were huge increases in cancer incidence and in birth defects in the areas where soy production happened. These are some of the crops that were lost. So Roundup Ready soy came in, and they pulled out their what do you call them? Their orchards, their fruit orchards. It caused them to produce the potato harvest was reduced from 3.4 to 2.1 million in just a couple years. Green peas, lentils, dry beans, animal proteins, eggs, dairy, all the vegetables, all the fruits, all were reduced in production to make room for Roundup Ready soy. The reason it was pushed this way was because the government, this was for export, and the government got a 30% tax on all of the revenues from this export. So it was very helpful to a government that was, at that point, nearly bankrupt. But it was extremely damaging to the people of the country. A huge price to pay. Here are some other things. The number of the population that was unable to access a good diet grew from 3.7 to 8.7 million, 25% of the population. During this period when Roundup crops came in, the percentage of the population below the poverty line increased from 15% to 47%, almost half of the population. These are huge changes in a population. It was a huge damaging thing to the farmers of the nation and to the people as a whole. This is presented as something that's going to benefit the agricultural system and the economy. Yesterday, Branko and I were talking about what could happen in Serbia if this happens. And he said, well, for instance, the seed industry in Serbia today is worth about $500 million of export every year. When Monsanto comes in, it will take over. We'll talk more about this later, but they will take over the seed industry. It will no longer be a Serbian industry. It will be an industry controlled by a multinational that takes that money out of the Serbian economy. It will have a huge negative effect on the Serbian agricultural economy. This is just one example at the first step in the agricultural chain. It will have similar steps at other levels as well. So it's serious, it's very serious. And going back to Argentina, some of the proponents of GMOs say, well, those changes occur, but it's not because of the GM soy. But in fact, there have been careful studies done by scientists in Argentina looking at what were the cause and effect matters here. And it was clear that GM soy production was a key factor in this movement, this depopulation of the countryside. They talk about GM soy production as farming without farmers. It reduces the percentage, the number of farmers needed to do the production to a great degree. So instead of many farmers, you only need 2 workers per hectare for 1,000 hectares. That's very much lower. And those workers do not have to be skilled farmers. They can be just anybody, because all they're doing is driving tractors and following directions about, well, what chemical do I spray on the field today, you know? So it's not real farming. The others say, well, the high adoption rate, Argentina, 95% of their their soy is GM. Well, it must be successful, that's being so common. And the reality is that if you look deeper, you see that there has been very significant manipulation of the seed and input markets. And this is a key point to recognize, is that the biotech industry uses its intellectual property, its patents, to manipulate the seed industry, to manipulate the industry in a number of ways so that they take control over the seed industry. And then the farmers don't have choice. They can either buy genetically engineered seeds, or they can buy genetically engineered seeds. No choice. There's simply no choice. Also in Argentina, they lobbied with the banks, and farmers that were going to grow GM soy could get financing for their crop. Farmers who were growing natural crops could not get that financing. So the farmers were pushed over to using GM crops in a very big way. So these are very effective strategies for manipulating. But now let's consider this question of whether GMOs are important or needed to feed the world. The first thing that must be very clear is that the core cause of hunger is not lack of food production. There's plenty of food in the world for everybody, more than enough. The hunger is not a production problem, it's a social and political problem. It's a problem having to do with access to food, or access to the land so that you can produce your own food. So that's the first key thing. But let's also look at whether GMOs are actually more productive. And in fact, there have been a number of studies now. This, I think, is one of the best studies that has been done looking at countries such as the US, where GMOs are very popular, and asking the question, are they higher yielding? Do they really contribute to larger production? And the conclusion of this study is that commercial genetically engineered crops have made no inroads into raising the intrinsic or potential yield of any crop. In other words, there is no GMO that has been commercialized today that has better yield than the natural crops from which it was derived. In fact, it's conventional breeding, normal breeding, that has given rise to the rapid increases in yields that have taken place in the last 30 years, 40 years around the world. So whatever crop you look at, it is this natural breeding that has been the source of those increased yields. So there's really no evidence that we need to take the risks associated with GM crops, either health or environmental risks, or in economic risks. There are better solutions, safer solutions, more effective, more sustainable solutions. And these make use of cutting-edge solutions within the most advanced sciences. People say, oh, genetic engineering is the most advanced approach. But in fact, it's not the most advanced approach. It is cumbersome, it's outdated, it's inflexible, it's ineffective, it's unnecessary. Let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Genetic engineering is like a piano with only a few little keys to play. You can play chopsticks on it, but you cannot play Mozart. In comparison to that, agroecology is comprehensive, it's integrated technologically. It makes use of the most modern understanding of biology and genetics and agronomy and all of the areas. And it is really like a symphony because it makes use of all of the different dimensions of nature to optimize the crop. And the key thing in any symphony, there's one person who's key, and it's this one right here, it's the director. And when we look at agroecology and compare it to genetic engineering, here's who's the conductor. In agroecology, it's Mother Nature. It's operating on that deep level of nature. With genetic engineering, you've got some wild scientist there who's probably never been outside of the lab, who has no idea of what agriculture really is about. They have some cool idea of, oh, I can engineer the crop to do this wonderful new thing, but they don't really understand nature deeply. I've been one of those crazy guys, I know. So, I want to end on one thing here. We have just a few minutes left here. And it comes back to the biotechnology message. Your Minister of Agriculture, probably your President, probably many of the ministers and members of Parliament and other decision makers in your government have been visited by Monsanto and DuPont and all these other biotechnology companies. And their message to your leaders are that GMOs have swept the world. And if your country doesn't come along with this scientific revolution, you're going to be left behind in the dark ages. This is what they're saying. Is this true? They say, look at this. There are 17 million farmers around the world growing GMOs. 170 million hectares. 28 countries have accepted GMOs. There's been a 100-fold increase in GMO production since 1996. Well, that sounds really impressive, doesn't it? Well, let's look a little deeper. Have GMOs really penetrated the market, the agricultural market, deeply? Well, look at it. 95% of all GMOs are in only 4 crops. Soybeans, corn, cotton, canola. Those are the only 4 crops where there are significant production of GMOs today. What about wheat, rice, pomegranates, all of the other things, zucchini, all of the other crops out there? What's going on? Here's an interesting one. 90% of all GMOs are produced in only 5 countries. And they're listed at the bottom. The USA, Brazil, Argentina, Canada, and India can be included there only because they have GM cotton, not a food product, a textile product. So those 5 countries account for 90% of all GMOs. Another 5 account for another 8%. And then there are 18 countries that produce tiny amounts of GMOs. They account for 2%. But what about those other 167 countries? 167 countries have said no to GMOs to date. Most countries in the world have not accepted GMOs. This is not a technology that has swept the world. It's a technology that is holding on by its fingernails to try to maintain its survival. It has had 20 years of commercial exposure, and it has failed to penetrate the markets. This, if I were an investor, I would not be investing in Monsanto or DuPont. I would be investing in something else. Others, they say, oh, so much land has been produced, 170 million acres. That accounts for less than 4% of the agricultural acreage, high-quality agricultural acreage around the world. This does not include pasture land or anything else like that. This is high-quality agricultural land. Less than 1% of the world's farmers use GMOs. So this is not a technology that has swept the world. Now, if you put 1 drop in the bottom of a bucket or a glass, you can't even find it. That's what we had with GMOs in 1996. Now, in 2013, we have 100 drops. Still not a big contribution to agriculture in this world. It's just a drop in the bucket. And this technology has not proved itself and is really on its way out because it's actually not at the cutting edge of biology. It's far from that. So why have they, very quickly, why have they failed to penetrate the market? The early GMOs were very simple. It was you put a gene into the crop, you turn it on full blast, and wonderful, it's resistant to herbs, or to herbicides, weed killers, or it's resistant to the bollworm. But from the very beginning, the biotech industry has been saying, well, yeah, these first ones are herbicide resistant, or they produce a pesticide, but we're going to create GMOs that have higher yields, or that are drought resistant, or have improved nitrogen utilization, or improved nutrition. They've been making these promises for 20 years, actually 30 years if you if you look at the scientific literature. But in fact, these promises, not a single one of these promises has been kept. They failed to really provide technology that meets these fundamental, important needs. So why is it that they failed? Why have they failed to fulfill these big promises? The answer is that although these earlier GMOs were very simple, it didn't take a lot of science to create Roundup-ready soybeans. It was really simple to do. But for yield resistance or drought resistance, to increase yields or to create drought resistance or nitrogen utilization improvement, for these things, it requires multiple genes. They all have to be inserted in the same plant in a way that doesn't cause damaging mutations. And they have to be regulated in a very sensitive, very delicate way. Genetic engineering is too cumbersome, too inflexible to actually achieve that. It's like trying to do heart surgery with a shovel. You just simply can't do it. And they will talk about it because when they say, well, we can make we can make crops that are climate ready. That's the thing. Drought resistant, resistant to flooding, resistant to all these problems. They use those phrases and they say, we want to feed the world. They use that for public relations purposes, but they cannot fulfill these aims. It's simply not the case. So, and on top of that, farmers don't, or consumers don't trust GMOs for good reasons. They're concerned about health and safety, and they're clear that there's this big fight out there about the safety of GMOs. And they say, well, okay, so some scientists think GMOs are fine, others don't. I'm not going to take this home to my children until I know they're safe. So I'll wait on that. And they also are concerned about transparency and trust. And they've seen that the biotech industry has been lobbying for weak regulations for safety, for health and safety of the environment. And they say, well, if the biotech industry thinks these are so great, then why don't they want them to be tested for safety in a serious way? And they also know that there has been strenuous effort by the biotechnology industry to prevent independent scientists from testing and studying their GMOs. Again, if they're so wonderful, why not be open and show them to the world and let any scientist study them? There's a whole literature on this. You can find it in Science and Nature and Scientific American. All of the major scientific journals have discussed the fact that they block scientists from doing this. And then also, they've been blocking governments, doing their very best to lobby governments to prevent labeling of GMOs for consumers. And again, if these are such wonderful crops, why aren't you proudly putting a big message on the front of the package saying, this is a genetically engineered crop. Take it home to feed to your children. They don't do that because they know they can't back up their claims. They know that these are inferior products. And they know that if they publicize it, consumers won't eat them. So this brings me to the very last point. I'm sorry I'm running over here a minute. GMOs threaten the health of the environment and environment, but this is not the big problem with GMOs. The big problem is that they threaten food security in every nation that they enter. And when you threaten food security, you threaten national security. The multinationals like GMOs because they can be patented. And they exploit these patent rights to take control of the seed industry, essentially to take control of the means of food production. They take control of the means of food production. It's said that he who controls food production controls the country. They control the nation. Do you want multinationals to control your food system here in Serbia? If you open the doors, they will do that. Think about it. This is what's happened in the U.S. seed industry. All of the little blue dots are seed companies that existed in 1995. All of the big dots are the biotechnology companies that now control them. There's literally a handful of companies that have controlled the whole seed system in America. America calls itself land of the free. I'm an American, but I would say that there are many countries that are freer because their agriculture is not controlled in this way. Their press is also is not so free in America either. And but this is all part of the same story. So this is more about seed consolidation. So the basic point is that even on the economic level, when the multinationals take control in this way, they siphon much of the value out of the country. You'll lose the value. Your economy will suffer because of this. So loss of food security, loss of national security and national sovereignty, inhibition of the national economy. These are the things that are at stake when you're introducing GMOs into your country. So if you have to accept something to become part of the EU, fine. But make sure that you put a ban in place, a moratorium in place that protects you in the same way that Germany and France and several other countries, Italy and many others have put in place that are part of the EU. You can protect yourself from GMOs and be part of the European Commission, the European Union. Make sure to put your laws in place in a way that protects you in that way. Thank you very much. These slides will be made available, and you can get them from the internet. And the last part was just a bunch of information about sustainable agriculture and how, in fact, it can solve these problems just as effectively. Thank you very much.